Morning, everyone. My name is Luke Gittos. Welcome to this Battle of Ideas session. Let's talk about sex, baby. I produced this session, but they changed the title. I pitched it under the title, What Makes Good Sex? So I can only presume that someone at the Academy of Ideas thought I was completely underqualified to judge a debate with that title, and so changed it to this one. The reason why I thought this was a worthwhile discussion is that in the aftermath of Me Too, the discussion around sexual violence shifted to a discussion on what constituted good sexual behaviour between people. And that started with behaviour on dates and then progressed to behaviour in the bedroom. We're now seeing the emergence of articles and books about reconstituting female pleasure in the bedroom and what that's all about. But it struck me that at the same time as looking for answers to this question, we hadn't really figured out what good sex meant or what kind of behaviour is okay when it comes to sex and relationships. There's some interesting statistics around millennials' approach to sex and relationships. Young people tend to be quite promiscuous. Fewer people than ever before see themselves getting married in due course, which is an interesting set of facts. You know, young people both promiscuous and not considering themselves wanting to get into long-term relationships. And just trying to make sense of that in a kind of broader cultural context, really. I've got an eminently qualified panel to speak about this. We're going to do it in a sort of question and answer format, much more possibly relaxed than the panel discussions that have happened elsewhere. So we'll be coming out to you relatively soon. But just to introduce my speakers, first on my immediate right is Zoe Strimpel. Zoe is a historian of gender and feminism from the University of Sussex. She's a columnist, a commentator. She's written two popular non-fiction books about gender. The first is called The Man Diet, One Woman's Quest to End Bad Romance. And What the Hell Is He Thinking? All the questions you ever asked about men answered. Which fascinating title, and hopefully she can give me some insight into what I'm thinking some of the time, because I often don't know. Second on my list is Emily Hill. Emily is well known to the Battle of Ideas. She's a writer. Her latest collection of short stories, Bad Romance, so there's a connection, at least in nomenclature with Zoe there, is out now. It's hilarious, it's brilliant, and it's an insight into contemporary relationships, biting satire, and I highly recommend you go and pick up a copy. So thanks for being with us, Emily. Madeline Grant, on my far left, is the editorial manager at the Institute of Economic Affairs. So again, a think tank which is constantly at the forefront of public debate in this country. But Madeline specifically has been asked because she wrote an essay on Me Too, which progressed very far in a very prestigious essay competition, and has just waded into a discussion which can be very risky for people to wade into at all, especially when you're working with an organisation, such a publicly facing organisation. It can carry its own risks. So thank you for being with us, Madeline. So Zoe, are you okay to kick us off with just a few remarks? I mean, in terms of provocations, tell us what you think about sex after Me Too.
Well, I was very concerned about sex after Me Too because I was in a relationship during the Me Too moment and then found myself out of one after about 6 months of it. And I did actually panic that it had done sort of irreparable damage. I think that was sort of over-the-top worry. But I do think that the way in which politics and sort of what is inherently a subjective murky gray area sort of aspect of personal life it's a problematic clash at the moment. So the thing to remember is that since the 1970s, the big innovation of feminism was to politicize the personal, and that was revolutionary at the time, and it did a lot of very good things. It really needed to be done. I think that what has happened now is that I think in the kind of need to innovate, in the need to sort of, I suppose, for feminists to innovate and for feminism to sort of innovate, that we've had to sort of push the boundary of what constitutes the personal as political. And in the case of Me Too, I mean, of course, it just went bananas because of the dynamics of sort of hashtag politics, about which I've been very critical. So I think, you know, we did reach a sort of crucial point with I don't know if you all know about the Aziz Ansari debacle, where, it's a famous American comedian who was seemed to be sexually inconsiderate on a date, perhaps verging on bad behavior, but it didn't seem to be, in the domain of abuse or assault. But anyway, he was called out for having not sought enthusiastic enough consent. So the woman on whom he'd been on the date with had sort of given cues, but he hadn't picked up on those cues. So there was a huge sort of death by Me Too for him. And I think that was the moment when we began to think, well, when the world began to, I had my suspicions before, but when the world began to think, actually, hang on, if we are now pushing some quite rigid and ideological kind of notions of gender politics and feminism right into the heart of this sort of inherently, as I said, gray area subjective transaction between two people where there are only these two witnesses, there will be, it's a very kind of worrying sort of slippery slope, I think, or it can be, and that was a prime example. So I began to think, if I was a man, I might start wanting sort of a consent app or something. I think those are now being developed, but that really, I'm not in any way saying, I'm actually not saying poor men. I'm not saying women just suck it up and accept sort of terrible sex. But I do think that, the sort of way in which the very inner heart of what constitutes an erotic encounter is now being subjected to these politics is inevitably leading to some negative effects, including potentially kind of killing off what constitutes the erotic full stop. I think the erotic is perhaps the thing that gets left out when we're thinking about power, thinking about sex, thinking about feminism, thinking about dating. And actually, if you say you could legislate everything, you could set rules for absolutely every aspect of your dating interaction. Would you then have anything left that constituted anything remotely erotic? I don't know. I have my suspicions.
Great, thanks, Zoe. Emily, do you want to pick up on any of that or anything new?
Yes, all of it. So I agree with Zoe in terms of Aziz Ansari and also Damien Green, who lost his job through porn on his computer and maybe accidentally slightly touching somebody's knee, but we're not really sure. But for me, Me Too, I like Me Too, and I know that is a very, very unpopular view, and won't earn me many friends in this little auditorium here, but I love Me Too. There was Julie Burchill wrote this bloody brilliant column, which didn't get published in The Spectator. It was only run online. The article that The Spectator did publish was that Me Too had made sex sexy again, which was typical Spectator. I think it hasn't made sex sexy again. It's what we're actually talking about with Me Too, how it started, was pretty serious allegations of rape and very, very bad sexual assault. And what happened was lots of women suddenly stood up and said, this sort of thing has happened to me. And when that was happening, I was thinking, yeah, this has happened to me. And I don't like it. And I didn't do the hashtag Me Too, but I thought, yeah, fucking Me Too. And it's all about, for me, it's all about power balances. And I would like a revolution in where we are today. And I think that the instinct behind Me Too, challenging all the powers that are set against us and actually trying to overthrow them, is actually a very exciting notion. And I do feel that most women instinctively like Me Too, and most men absolutely fucking hate it. There's the idea that sort of woman throughout history has been the proletariat. Suddenly women were actually saying, all this stuff has happened to me. And I'm not talking about, I completely agree with Zoe when it comes to Aziz Ansari. And it's funny the people who have kind of gone down, because it's always the men who kind of, expressed some kind of interest in the subject and sort of said, oh, da-da-da-da, and sort of made themselves out to be very holy figures, and then women are coming out and saying, "Oh no!" And it's usually the women who haven't suffered any kind of serious. Because what I'm talking about is rape and sexual assault, which I do think that happens. And throughout history, women have been told that men are able to use your bodies in any way they like, and you're just supposed to shut up about it and get on with it. And I don't agree with that. One of the things that Julie Burchill wrote in her column, she was quoting an American poet and activist whose name I can't pronounce, called Muriel Rukeyser, I think. What would happen if one woman told the truth about her life? The world would split open. And I do think that is what has happened to a certain extent. I think it's interesting also as a free speech issue, because I think personally for me, looking at Harvey Weinstein, that's about women's experience being silenced consistently by the legal system over many, 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 many years. And actually one of the things that I have problems with in terms of super injunctions is the fact that women, for instance, being silenced by footballers, by various, if you work in newspapers, you have a long list of women who aren't allowed to tell or sell their story, even though they have, suffered, you would say, or at least been treated very, very, very shoddily in a very quite serious way, and they're being silenced because men say they have a right to a family life and they have a right to privacy, and they often use their children as human shields. And then I also think that Me Too, I can see why people are really uncomfortable with it, because it's been hijacked by certain political movements and political stances. And it's interesting with Brett Kavanaugh, like everybody believes, in the Democratic Party, what they want to, I believe her. But there's a very interesting podcast, which Slate is running, called The Slow Burn, which is about Monica Lewinsky and what happened with Bill Clinton. And I'm going to shut up now because I've been talking too long, but it's remarkable what Bill Clinton did to women. He raped, it sounds like he raped a woman. He had these really horrible power relationships with women throughout. And the really chilling thing at the end of that documentary is very, 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 very quick kind of, postscript at the end. It's like Hillary Clinton completely profited off that. Her approval ratings went through the roof. And one of the most controversial ideas I had for The Spectator, which I did write, is that actually during his the presidential election, actually Donald Trump in certain senses was making more feminist arguments than Hillary Clinton was, because he was at least taking women seriously.
Thanks, Emily. That's great. Madeline.
So, yeah, we've heard about the Aziz Ansari examples from the two previous speakers, and some would say that that's an example of a kind of an excess of the Me Too movement, but I would actually argue that the Aziz Ansari case is highly symptomatic of the Me Too movement. There is this kind of pattern of conflation of very serious incidents with much more trivial incidents, and I think that pattern of trivialization and conflation could potentially unravel the Me Too movement, which started with such potential, because ultimately the aims of the Me Too movement as a result of all of this have become kind of diffuse enough to be meaningless. So, yes, I think that the movement has become a kind of tidal wave of outrage, which indiscriminately sweeps up much more trivial examples of harassment. And I worry also that in some of its censorious excesses, and we will hear a lot about the excesses, but I think that's very important to discuss those excesses because they have a much wider effect on society. They trickle down into ordinary social interaction, obviously. And I worry that in these excesses, we risk going back towards a kind of censorious, archaic idea of modesty. So sex is almost innately messy. I mean, I don't just mean physically messy, although of course it is, but I mean emotionally, in the sense that it represents a kind of trial and error process between two people. And I fear that Me Too takes, on the whole, quite a harsh and unforgiving eye towards mistakes. I think there has got to be room for someone to attempt a clumsy come-on and for it to be rebuffed and for that to end in good-humoured, agreement between those two parties. And I'm not saying that this entirely relates to the Me Too movement, but just as our attitudes towards sex appear to have becoming more permissive, there is also a trend of my generation, the millennials, appearing to, in some ways, turn away from sex. There is, according to some recent research from the Department of Education, it is believed that 1 in 8 26-year-olds are currently virgins, compared to 1 in 20 a decade ago. Now,
I certainly don't believe that is entirely related to the Me Too movement. I think our sexual culture tends to occupy extremes. On the one hand, we have a highly kind of pornified culture, and on the other hand, we have a Me Too movement, which is actually, in its worst moments, crying out for sexual exchange to be kind of codified, for there to be new rules of engagement between the sexes. But it's not yet clear what those rules are. There's a crying out for change, but there are no leaders of this movement, and it's very difficult to figure out what that change would be. So I think there's a great deal of confusion around sex, and I think that for the Me Too movement, which I believe has the potential to create real social justice, to drive a conversation about better sex generally, we need to stick to certain fundamentals, one of which is, allow there to be some reasonable dissent, allow people to criticise the Me Too movement. Let's not throw people who agree with the fundamental aims, people who are not sexist, to be kind of tarred and feathered when they express a reasonable critique of the movement. Let's stick to things like the presumption of innocence. I think above all, we need to stop this pathologizing of masculinity that I've seen as a result of the Me Too movement, where we talk about, generally toxic masculinity and what can we do to keep masculinity in check. I think there's a real danger that in our haste to redefine the rules of engagement, that we go at it in too extreme a way and we end up throwing half the human race under the bus in the process.
Thank you, Madeline. So as I say, the format is just going to be quite relaxed. We're going to take some more remarks from the panel and then we'll come out to you in a few minutes. But I thought those remarks were really helpful, Madeline, because we can all obviously talk about Me Too and sexual violence, but we also want to talk about sexual culture, which is a really interesting point. And I think, Zoe, I wanted to ask you, historically, what you see in terms of our sexual morality now in today's context, because you often hear about people being more free, people being released from the constraints of the past, and that seems absolutely obvious. We don't only have sex to procreate, we can have sex outside of marriage. There's very few rules governing when and how you have sex. But do you, has any morality replaced that? Are we living in the time of no sexual morality, or are we living in a time where it's all about self-satisfaction, or what's replaced the old constraints of the past, I suppose?
Well, I guess first, speaking as the historian, I'd want a little bit more specificity about what part of the past we're talking about. And clearly, the distant past, if we're going to lump it all together, yes, there wasn't sort of reliable contraception. There was the withdrawal method, basically. There was the expectation that women would get married and reproduce. There wasn't a sort of free-floating, you can be single and explore yourself thing. But what my period is actually 1970s onwards, because perhaps those who are young adults in the 1970s in the audience can chime in after. But that to me was a sea change when sort of drastic, the sort of liberatory campaigns of the 1960s sort of took root in feminism, but in many, many other sort of changes, legislative, demographic, and so on. And the result was like an explosion in sexual freedom and experimentation in the 70s, which I think, went a bit far. The first, I find this amusing, the first nude so we went from censorship laws to Lady Chatterley's lover, going through a trial in 1960 for obscenity, to in 1970, it's the early 70s, maybe 72, the Times running Britain's first fully nude advert, and it was for an industrial fertilizer, and it just had this picture of this naked woman sort of being sexy over industrial fertilizer. And I think now we would think of that as being a little bit over the top. And I think that there was a sort of expansion in opportunities and experimentations in the 70s. There was lots of communal living experiments. There was absolutely taking up, absolutely fundamental. Now there was universal pill and abortion, pill provision and abortion. So that had sort of immeasurable effects. However, I think there has been something of a contraction since then. I think we would all think a naked woman advertising industrial fertilizer in the Times would seem a little bit over the top. And I think there's a very interesting generational clash going on now between baby boomers' sexuality and the sexuality of sort of my generation. And I think we often think baby boomers are a little looser, perhaps, in their what they deem sort of acceptable. At the same time, what has been touched on, several major factors, let's say, have shaped our sexual culture, like porn, like digitization, have we replaced... Okay, so the question becomes, what is our sexual morality? If we are in some ways more conservative than I would argue we were in the 1970s, I think our morality now is to do with upholding some very, quite a draconian, but also a positive idea of rights. And part of that is sort of quite a detailed and committed understanding of what constitutes women's sexual response and women's sexual pleasure. So I think the morality, if there is one now, is sort of pinned to gender equality and a sort of feminist sexual morality. On one hand, which is saying sex is, there's a duty now to take women's experience seriously in sex. And I can tell you, based on my sources, again, the people in the audience who lived through this time can differ with me, but women's sexual response was not really understood or being taken seriously in the 1970s. And there was this pre-orgasmic group thing that flourished, where women were going, they called it pre-orgasmic groups, because many women, they didn't have orgasms, they didn't know how, they were born to parents born in the 1920s, 1930s. It was shrouded, it was shrouded in problems and mystery, and I think that we've absolutely replaced that with a sort of women's pleasure is front and center.
You can come back in a while. Emily? Anything or everything?
Okay, so everything. I'm just going to do everything. Okay, so there's sort of various things, because I think the thing is that feminism has kind of been overlooked in terms of some of the things that it's trying to achieve, and that we should maybe look at that and actually think, okay, so this is just ridiculous and hysterical, most of it, but some of it, if you dig into the figures, then there's problems. I do worry about the gender pay gap, for instance. Like, if you look at the Soviet societies that were established post-1917, childcare was taken very, very seriously to help and liberate women. Another thing that I think is worrying, having done a full investigation for Tatler magazine, is that there is a very serious orgasm gap. And women are not having orgasms as much as they should, and the quality of sex is going down. And I do generally think this is to do with technology. So the pill was liberating for women because you don't have to worry about getting pregnant, but I swear to God, dating apps are doing something else. So I was a dating columnist last year, very gloriously, and I believe that dating apps have done to love and romance what the machines did to humanity in Terminator 2. I'm not joking. It's a fucking shit show out there. And I don't understand how anybody has an orgasm with anyone. And I think orgasm is extremely fucking important. So that's what I have to say.
More than enough. Thank you. Madeline.
I actually agree about I agree about the rise of technology being a problem for intimacy, not just dating apps, which I think we'll see a heightening of this post Me Too, because dating apps offer a way of connecting and kind of codifying your relationship, getting written proof of things that are happening in a way that approaching someone in a bar, which is now fraught with all sorts of dangers, does not have. I think technology also represents a threat to intimacy in the sense that we take our phones everywhere. We go to bed with our partners and our mobile phones at the same time. And I think that we could really do with some kind of a moratorium on all that and a return to genuine intimacy. I'm very interested in why it is that there is this generational trend in my generation, the kind of millennials and also Gen Z, away from towards a kind of clean living. They're well known for drinking less, much less likely to smoke, taking fewer drugs, partying less, and also it seems having less sex. Some might say that that's a good thing, that we should instead be applauding younger generations for, deciding to make the kind of healthy lifestyle change that the NHS and public health forums are kind of paying millions trying to get baby boomers and older generations to do, whereas the young are simply moving that way in their entirety. But I feel a bit more sanguine about all of this, because I see also a much higher level of anxiety. I don't think people having less sex is a good thing. Sex can be fantastic, and it's a shame that people appear to think that it's not worth the risk of bothering, or it's not of interest to them. So I think that the way that this feeds into the Me Too movement is that, as I said at the beginning, sex is a kind of trial and error process in which there has to be some room for people to kind of get things wrong. And I think that in order to, just as you often find out the job that you want to do by doing a job that you really hate beforehand. And that's how you learn what it is that you truly want to do. I think you do sometimes have to kind of kiss a few frogs before you get to the prince. And if people are talking themselves out of the dating game, if people are not taking the risk, they're not kind of putting themselves out there in the first place, then they risk of missing that trial and error process, which is really crucial and really formative.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to come out... Thank you very much. I'm going to come out to the audience, so if you put your hands up and let me see who wants to speak. It'd be very interesting to hear what people think about contemporary sexual culture. I mean, what's it like out there? Is it a shit show, as Emily suggests? Or has Tinder and apps made it, you can go out and binge on self-fulfillment and get all the sex you need?
I thought what you said, Madeline, about our sexual culture being very stratified, very interesting. I think you can only look at the existence and the mass appeal and success of 50 Shades of Grey in a society of Me Too as being an example of that. Historically, women have been told to be very puritanical and to not talk about their sexual pleasure, and I think that that's changing. If you look at statistically, women are the biggest consumers of BDSM and sexual or violently sexual pornography. So my question is, what is the future for women's empowerment to talk about sexual pleasure in a post-Me Too era?
Thank you, great question. Yeah, here?
Hi, my name is Sarah. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is Sarah. I wanted to ask, with the movement of Me Too and other movements where women are kind of made to feel like they have to have a certain kind of sexual idea, so that they shouldn't be dominated by men, they shouldn't be allowed to have, those kind of traditional ideas where, for example, this reminds me of one Doctor Who episode I watched, a Christmas special. I remember they were talking about a couple, right, and how they met was in the 1950s, and basically the woman was followed home by her husband. Now, in a modern-day era, if you thought about that, a woman getting followed home by a man she meets a potential partner, that's obviously a bit creepy. So my point is, do you think women are being shamed for maybe those kind of traditional sexual kind of ideas that they thought women would like now in modern day times?
Excellent question, and
good
really
question.
something that's worth exploring, because I think one of the assumptions of Me Too is that there is some established set of rules that people should be following, which begs the question, well, who decides and what are the rules, and why should anyone's particular preference take over other people's? So thank you very much for that.
I loved listening to all your ideas. My question is about, in the era of the Me Too movement and looking at the experience with Dr. Ford and the Kavanaugh judgment, people did say that they believed her, but some still other agendas prevailed. So is it fair to still criticize Me Too movement so much when when in an era where, yes, women's voices are being somewhat out there, but can we really say they're actually being heard and believed? And the other thing is, when you talked about there needs to be a margin of error in the sexual relationship experience with people, who determines that margin? And isn't the Me Too movement kind of supposed to say we've seen the alternative of not having a margin, of not having that clear-cut consent, and what determines that a margin of error? What is error and what is okay and what can be deemed to be fine, let it go?
Great, thank you very much. And then we'll go to the chap with the glasses there.
Germaine Greer has a book recently published called On Rape. And amongst other things that she claims, I think two of perhaps the most interesting, most relevant to this are that she, on the one hand, she says that she'd like to see far greater sentence, in terms of numbers, far more people accused of rape and found guilty being sentenced, but at the same time, a reduction in the seriousness of the sentence that follows. And on the other side, she talks about something that's been quite controversial in her interviews more recently, where she says that the category of the rape victim has become a social category, and she suggests that a recent problem in some kind of feminist discourses, I guess, is that people end up internalising a sense of how they ought to react to being raped, and she thinks that's a problem because she, from her own example, discusses how she never read a rape that happened to her as being any worse than any other physical assault she or a male had suffered. And I'm just interested in that thought and about this debate about the extent to which it's appropriate to self-define the degree of trauma we've experienced from these events.
Hi, I'm very much with Madeline in being worried about a certain demographic of young people who are kind of feminists and feminist allies, Me Too allies, people who are not having sex and who are worried about it. And it puts me in mind of a programme I watched at the beginning of the Me Too movement called The Problem with Men. And on it, there was a young man his contributions really stuck with me because it was a panel of men in the audience and they were all asked, what are the boundaries in terms of touching people who you know? And this young man said, there is never any reason to touch anybody without consent. And I thought that was absolutely tragic because, there's camaraderie and there's sympathy and also romance, and that's essential in itself. And then I went out with a drink with the mums from school to this kind of working class bar a couple of nights later. And I was coming back from the toilets, and this guy just picked me up, spun me round, and put me down. And I looked around the bar, and everyone was having these really normal interactions. And I thought, God, this isn't a problem for everyone. These people haven't even heard of Me Too. So I think it's kind of a middle-class problem, actually. And I think we're kind of going back to the brief encounter, like juxtaposition of having a really uptight middle class who are really inhibited and a working class who are a lot more free and who I'd much rather spend time with, actually.
Thank you very much. I take your point. It's just interesting to then think about the statistics around millennials who are seeming to be having sex with more partners than previously. They're a more promiscuous generation. Fair enough. Okay.
So I was really interested in the idea of the orgasm gap. I was just wondering if you thought that had anything to do with education, because I've heard a lot of suggestions about how the new sex ed should perhaps be teaching things like female pleasure as well as male pleasure, but also then the obvious counter-arguments of that, of whether that's the sort of thing people should be figuring out themselves and that teachers and grown-ups in their lives probably shouldn't be as involved in. I was just wondering the opinions on that.
Okay. I'm going to come back to the panel and then come back out to the audience. So I've seen who wants to speak. I'll go in reverse order, as it were. Madeline.
Yes.
Come back on the thing.
There were so many amazing questions there. I think I just wanted to quickly touch on the lady's point here about Me Too and has it been reaching everyone? And certainly, I think there were definite questions about the kind of some of the sexual alarmism that has come out as a result of Me Too. As you quite rightly say, I think there are many scenarios. I've had male colleagues, for example, who now say that they will not have a meeting, especially a senior colleague, they will not have a meeting alone with a female colleague if the door is open. Unless the door is open, rather. Sounds a bit dodgy, doesn't it? So there's that. There's also Sheryl Sandberg, her Lean In initiative, did a survey of male managers, and they found that only about a third of male managers now would not feel comfortable mentoring a female colleague. So I don't think that this over-sanitisation of the workplace as a result of Me Too is harmless. I think it's got real knock-on implications. It could potentially be quite harmful to progressing our careers. I don't know about you, but I've had many, as a young woman in the workplace, I've been mentored by many colleagues over the years, including male colleagues, and I think it's a real shame if those interactions were being, chilled as a result of Me Too. And I think there is often a very Victorian element to all of this. So to go back to the Aziz Ansari element that we talked about before, what he's guilty of in that scenario was failing to read non-verbal cues from the girl that he was on a date with. Now, to me, the fact that he alone appears to be sort of blamed for that, I find somewhat troubling, because it seems to imply that the burden of determining consent now falls entirely on the man, and that I read that story, it struck a chord with me. I've definitely been on dates where I felt I did things that I was not entirely comfortable with. But I think the conversation we need to be having there is also, why is it that women don't feel capable of vocalising what they feel? And I hate the idea that all the burden of determining consent now has to go directly to the man, because that's very Victorian, actually. It assumes that women are incapable, even if they're not, even if they're not absolutely plastered in the corner, are somehow incapable of giving consent. So this is my point. I think Me Too has huge potential, but I worry about the excesses dragging down the movement as a whole.
Great, thanks. Emily?
So I just quickly pick up on a couple of points Madeline made. First of all, I have been hit on by my boss. I have suffered various things because of that kind of thing. So I think a lot of women do. I would like in the future women not have to put up with that kind of stuff. I don't think it's just women. A very disturbing comment that a very dear friend of mine told me was that all gay men have been raped. Now, I don't think that rape should happen either. So that's for me too. For me. That is what Me Too means. Sarah, who said about the Doctor Who episode, you're absolutely right. Love Actually would be some kind of like prosecutable offence. Like, the guy who turns up at the doorstep with the things, like he would be going to jail, where he should be. And
so creepy, that.
Yeah, very, very fucking creepy. The dude who mentioned Germaine Greer, you're absolutely right. The way the feminism movement has treated Germaine Greer is absolutely shocking and outrageous, and she should be making all these points. These are very valid discussions. The idea that she's no platformed and she's kind of thrown off, and like everything that she said is sort of some kind of like provocation. It's obviously she's very provocative, and that's brilliant. But the idea that this woman is silenced of the female eunuch, like everybody should read that. Everybody, like that's, I read it every year. Right, there was another point, this lady over there who said about the working class, yes, I know what you mean. Where I go out on Friday nights and Saturday nights, there's no fucking problem. I would also say that men are learning from Donald Trump, because one man I went on a date with, he grabbed me by the pussy. So I wasn't pleased with that, but I just slapped him, and then the evening ended with us parting. That was fine. That's what I have to say.
Perfect, thank you. Zoe?
Just to the point about women talking about desire after Me Too, I have to say, I think that there's a lot of talking about female pleasure and desire and sexual response, and that was what I was trying to say in my first or second sort of speechy thing here. That, I think, is one of the big changes in sexual culture that we're all dealing with when we go on dates. I find it puzzling that there's a sort of culture in which women, and perhaps this is where we do need to bring some class elements into it. I think that should infuse all of what we're saying, really, if we had the kind of time. But that to me seems a little bit bewildering, and it brings me to the point about margin of error slightly, because I think what connects these things is what women feel able to say and assert, and that's to do with power. And the thing that has sort of irritated me or fascinated me throughout the entire Me Too era has been the use of the concept of power and the word power. And power originates as an obsession in the academic world, as something that's sort of everywhere but nowhere, and it determines unequal social relations and stuff. But I think it can be used in a very bizarre and counterproductive way. For example, in this sort of discourse that gets entrenched that power is fixed, men have it, men can grab at it, women don't have it. It's not. That it's inherently kind of allocated wrongly to men, and women have a much smaller piece of the pie. I think what we need to do, and this I think speaks to both of these points to some degree, is kind of completely rethink power as a fluid thing, or as just like a cake that everyone can grab and have some of. So I think that gets to the heart of these questions of consent, these questions of what constitutes okay. We're never going to be able to come up with enough precise rules as to how sex should be. So there has to be something much more fundamental that happens, which is that women should not feel that and they don't need to feel, this is why they don't need to feel that they can't speak up. So why do they feel that they can't speak up? There's no physical thing preventing them from speaking up, from being aggressive. And I've talked to a lot of women from an older generation who are mystified by much of the spirit of Me Too, and much of this idea that saying things is a very treacherous domain, and there's all this power that's acting upon women, and that they can't possibly kind of push back and sort of say what they want. So I think that we need to rethink power as something that women can absolutely sort of grab if they want. And on the Germaine Greer thing, I did an Al Jazeera program called Head to Head at the Oxford Union with Germaine Greer and Laurie Penny and one other panelist who was great. But I was wheeled out to defend Germaine, and I was a little bit worried about that because I thought, maybe I'll be seriously, trolled. It'll be awful, and she's so But do you know what? It was actually very easy to defend her because I didn't even care that much about what she was saying, which I think was mostly fair. She went off the deep end in some places. But the fact that she was exercising that concept of power that I'm talking about, she was saying things that nobody else has the guts to say, and I just thought they just don't make them like her anymore. So I think we need to sort of remember that we can all kind of be Germaines if we want, in whatever way we want. It doesn't even have to be in feminism. It can be in any domain. Yep.
Thanks. Okay, I'll come here.
I'm really interested in this idea of actually empowering women to take more ownership of their own sexual pleasure and sexual interactions and how they're initiated and everything. I think that could be a real key in progress here. I was chatting with my other half, I'll keep it PG-13, don't worry, before, about how many times had she been rejected. And it was virtually zero. I've been rejected tons of times because men have to be the aggressor in nearly all sexual initiations. And we're clumsy. And we're trying to figure it out, and we're getting better. But also, you're all different. Women, some of you want different things. So I totally agree with the trial and error piece. And what happens is, when a woman's validation of you as a man is so important in how you're seen and your success, what you'll do if a woman rejects you is immediately you'll turn her into an object because it hurts less. You'll say, oh, she's fucking slut anyway. Didn't want her anyway, right? So we can get around that by actually encouraging women to be the aggressor sometimes. And maybe there'll be some kickback in terms of reputational damage. But in my experience, the people criticizing women for promiscuity tend to be other women. And it's like, prop yourselves up and, it's a group project here. Let's...
In the middle.
Thank you. I feel like a lot of the rhetoric around Me Too has become so politicized with consent and with all of these rules and things like that. But I feel like at its core, it's really just about listening and open communication on both sides. And I remember in the beginning of talk about consent, I felt so uneasy about it. And then when somebody said, "Is it okay if I kiss you?" I just felt like it was really taking my agency away. It felt kind of demeaning in a way. And I'm really against the whole consent movement. I guess I can't say against it, but it makes me feel as if they're, taking that ownership. And it's like, I can make my own decisions. And if we're in a situation where something would happen, it involves two people. And I think it's kind of unfair for men to always have to ask for consent. Is this okay? And I think... we should give women more credit, where if they want to do it, they do it, and if they don't want to do it, they say, I don't want to do this. So I think the consent is actually taking agency away from women, when instead of having consent workshops, we should be having open communication workshops between both people. Yeah.
At the back there.
Hello, I'm Tillman from Germany, so perhaps I'm a father of 4 girls, so perhaps I'm a bit out of the business now. But what I wonder, for me, sex is far more than a physical interaction. I think sex is a very special sphere. It's a field of experimentation. Two people experience a very special thing bad things can happen. It's a sphere of recreation. It's a sphere, a very important sphere of a relationship between men and women and of partnership. And I have the impression through, perhaps Me Too, but through all the sex columns we have, through dating apps, it gets more and more a thing of the public sphere, not of the private sphere anymore. And my question to the panel is, can we have real good sex if it's a public thing? Can we have experience really good sex anymore?
Great, thanks. So we're going to carry on taking. I'm just interested in speaking also about relationships, because that hasn't really come up yet. So why would people be in long-term relationships today? And has the meaning of what relationships are changed? Should we be worried about young people not wanting to get married? Does that mean anything? But feel free to ignore me and carry on talking about sex. It's absolutely fine.
Something I've noticed in the last couple of years is that more and more men are being put off sex and dating in general. And I think there's a little more to that than just a fear of false allegations. You can notice it particularly with movements like Men Going Their Own Way, that they're simply stopping to feel the need for relationships. And I was just wondering what the panel's thoughts are on why that is and what we could do to combat that without taking away from the movement to increase women's sexual agency as well.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, those guys are weird. I don't know if you've ever seen them. Terrifying. Here?
Why do you think discussions about healthy sexual behaviour are primarily taking off among straight women? How are the discussions they're having among other communities like gay men? Because on the back of a similar comment, every gay person I know has been sexually harassed at one stage. But why are the discussions mainly having among straight women?
Interesting. Here?
I would just like to touch on what the lady down the front, the young lady down the front said. As a mother of two, a boy and a girl, I feel like I've got a huge responsibility to guide my children and talk to them about sex. And my son's 15, and we've openly recently discussed what it's going to be like for him going into a relationship and how he's going to feel comfortable being with a girl. And I think that we need to look at the fundamentals of how we're going to move forward and how we are going to open these discussions up, because I think, as parents, we have a responsibility. I understand that not all parents feel comfortable doing that. And actually, a lot of adolescents would be horrified if their parents did speak to them about sex. But if they can't speak to their parents, we should be creating these forums. And I think someone down the front said, we need to create debate between the sexes. I mean, the Me Too thing, I can completely support, but I just think it almost alienates men from women. And I think we need to be bridging the gap, bringing sexes together, making men feel, embracing feminism. When I told my son, that I'd hoped that he would be a feminist, he just looked at me in complete horror. He had no idea what I was talking about. So I think schools and universities, open debate, freedom of speech, let's cock it up, let's make mistakes, but let's talk about it, and let's encourage young people to talk to one another.
Great, thank you. Okay, we'll take a quick question.
I know it's something that's been discussed throughout the festival, but what do you think about consent classes in university? We just heard. Do you think that trivialises the whole matter? What do you think that adds to the whole Me Too movement and the way that young people are interacting with each other? If we come into universities and we're then told, are you sure you know how to say yes or no?
Thanks. Consent classes, interesting.
Hello, my name's Tracy. More of a couple of comments, really, than questions. I guess I'm in maybe a unique position here in that I was around in what you call the pre-orgasm era, and I don't recognise that because we were certainly having lots of orgasms in those days.
No, there were a lot of pre-orgasm groups. I'm not saying women didn't have orgasms, but many weren't, apparently.
However, I think one of the reasons that I was and my friends were because we were discovering feminism, and we were in women's groups at the time. The thing was that in those days, I think I was fairly promiscuous, but it was more because I felt it was my right rather than I really, really wanted to. Whereas nowadays, at the other end of the spectrum, and this is a comment about dating apps as well, wow, I love them. I discovered dating apps at the age of 59, and I'm still very excited by them. And now it's more about desire rather than right. But also, it might be because I only have sex with women nowadays, so who knows?
That's exactly what it is. I'm sorry. A woman knows a woman's body. So a woman knows how to make a woman orgasm, and that is, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that's why you're having a lovely time. I only wish I was a lesbian. Seriously, I'd be so much happier.
But also, I mean, one of the other things I would like to bring up is that all we talk about is men being aggressors and, you know...
Yeah, I don't like the word aggressor, by the way.
I didn't like that either. However, yeah, I think we know what you mean.
Yeah.
It also happens in the gay world. I mean, someone said about all men have been... I think it was you said all men have been, gay men have been raped. I don't know about that.
No, that was a comment from a gay friend.
Oh, okay.
I don't say that.
Yeah, but there is sexual aggression between women as well.
Yeah.
So, but the Me Too thing, I think is fabulous.
We'll come back and sum up in a couple of minutes. I just want to get the last couple of questions in. So here.
Yeah, so obviously the conversation is centred around women, and we've already heard that it should be including gay men, but also straight men and straight women in terms of experimenting, and then also not rescinding consent, but almost saying, I didn't like that. And also it happens with women and men saying, I didn't enjoy that, and I'm regretting I'm going to withdraw consent, but also with experimental people saying it wasn't for me and I was pushed into it or whatever it is. And I think it's really important that we discuss, retrospective consent. Yeah.
Thank you.
It seems in a way that everyone's really comfortable with it, and you know, all the feminists are sex positive feminists, and everyone's interested in female sexual pleasure, and you know, all really comfortable with talking about dildos, masturbation, and all this sort of thing. But at the same time, and a lot of the feminist sort of critiques is about power and power in relationships, and that's the only problem. But then there's this discussion about men's attitude towards sex being a problem, toxic masculinity, and men not being in touch with their emotions, and men having the, you know, seeing women as pieces of meat, as sex objects, and that's been a problem. So, is that an attack on casual sex? You know, is it wrong to go out on the pull just to have sex and just to see a woman as physically attractive, or should men pursue positive and healthy relationships? Is that the only sort of legitimate way of performing sex, or are we all just comfortable about casual sex?
That's a really good question, actually, and it's one that I think really goes to the heart of this. And part of the reason for putting this session on was wondering, in this new context, whether there is any other sorts of behaviour that we might think of as immoral. So if we accept that it's wrong for anyone to go out and treat someone else like an object, is that universally applicable? So I was thinking about some of my most promiscuous friends, and some of them will knowingly, for example, both men and women, sleep with people that they know are really, really emotionally into them, and then just leave them and say, well, forget about it. And is that okay? I mean, is that, because presumably that's still about fulfillment and desire or whatever, but is there anything else that should come into our moral thinking here, or are we in a state of anything goes? But each panellist has got 2 minutes to sum up, so quite a healthy amount of time, really. But I'll go in the same order that we started, if that's all right. Zoe?
Well, just responding quickly to that. Interesting, because that's that contraction of like morality. Are we getting more Victorian or not? And the fact that you've got, yes, a culture of casual sex on one hand. You also have the rise of ethical polyamory, which is all over the apps. But then you also have like national freak out when a Strictly Come Dancing, participant kisses someone. Okay, it then became about gaslighting, but the initial issue was the kiss. So infidelity is really still not tolerated. So I think that's interesting. There's a massive contradiction there. Lots of casual sex, and yet a tightening of sexual morality in some areas. Public sphere, private sphere, very interesting. Sex was absolutely the public sphere for basically all of time, apart from very recently, like say after the 1960s. Women's bodies very much part of the kind of reproductive agenda of a larger system. But I agree with you that sex should be seen as special. And what does this this politicization of the minutiae of sex due to, as I said at the beginning, the erotic, I would say that part of the problem isn't so much lawsuits around what happens during sex, but the amount we talk about sex. We talk about sex all the time. I think that is actually destroying sex. We should talk less about sex, I think, and that might bring back some of its specialness. Why are men put off sex? Well, I think we might want to consider, apart from porn, which is the kind of classic desensitizing factor that everyone says, opportunity cost is an interesting one. What else can you be doing with your time? I think that, in the golden age of television, sex becomes much less attractive because you could just go home and watch an absolutely wonderful thing on TV, and it's like so much, you know it's going to be great and nurturing to the soul. And I think one of the reasons the US has a much more kinky, bizarre, extreme, polarized sexual culture is that the US has a much more broken system of things are really expensive. There's no sort of, I think a lot of people are much more disenfranchised. So actually, what can you do that's free and exciting? You can get up to all kinds of things to do with sex. So I think if you've got plenty and options, then you might choose not to have sex. Gay sex, very good question. Part of these codes of masculinity, I think, still influence the way men talk about sex, including gay men. Surely I have 20 seconds, no?
You have 5 seconds.
Okay, final thing, and this goes back to the first book I wrote, which is actually What the Hell Is He Thinking, about making men feel included, the point about your son. Yes, conversations with men, this sort of interesting return of men are from Mars, women are from Venus, men are mean, men are predators, we're power, all that stuff. I entirely think you're right. You should just engage men normally like you would engage a woman or whoever, and treat people with a similar approach, and absolutely sort of get away from that sort of polarization, which I think is actually very regressive.
Great, thanks, Zoe. Emily.
So very, very quickly, consent classes, the lady who asked about consent classes. The thing is with consent classes, completely agree, it's invasive and ridiculous in many ways, but also men, when they've had too much to drink, their penises don't work, so they can't actually have sex. And if a woman is comatose, don't ever have sex with her. I think that is worth pointing out. And you should know that, but I don't agree there should be classes, but that really needs to be kind of reiterated. That's where it's come from, I think. Can we have real good sex in the public space? No. Sex is private. Sex is very best when you're doing all sorts of naughty things that you would never admit to anybody. The power we give to men, we do give it to men, and we should stop giving it to men. I think this is a very Germaine Greer thing to say, but I do think there are very strong differences between what a man is and what a woman is, and the way, mainly due to our biology and our bodies, and the main thing of that is the way we orgasm. And it's been shown that women do tend to orgasm more efficiently, more brilliantly, more spectacularly when they're in a loving relationship, because they are able to show what a man should do with their bodies, because you know exactly how to ejaculate a man. That's not a problem. But in terms of what you do with a woman's body, there's this OMG yes, which I've learned through Emma Watson, to my great shame. But anyway, we should check that out if you don't know what to do. Toxic masculinity, I get what you're saying in a certain sense. I think that we do have to kind of celebrate what my friend would call good throwdown, which is what we all need in that kind of bedroom kind of thing. So if all this conversation is getting rid of that, that's terrible. And then to Madeline's disturbing point that I found is, which is absolutely what women think, is this kind of notion that you have to kiss a load of frogs before you meet your prince. I find that very, very, very disturbing. I think what we should be doing is not kissing any frogs at all. We should be out there, instead of waiting for sort of the prince to kind of drop from the sky or magically a poof after, so we're sort of snogging some toad. You want to be sort of going out there and thinking,
you may be taking my metaphor a little literally.
Who do we? No, but I think you're right though. I think you're right, because very quickly, I think that women think that men have to approach them, and what we should be doing in the modern society where we're all equal is we should be going out and saying who we fancy in an aggressive way, as you say.
Thank you very much, Emily.
I completely agree with that. You may notice that in the analogy I used, you are kissing the frog. You just don't necessarily... Sometimes you have to go out with people. You have to have a few bad dates where you listen to a few absolute bores tell you about the business they're setting up before you're like, no, actually, I can't bear this. I don't want to go out with you. I want to go out with someone who listens to me. And that's the trial and error process. I certainly don't mean that we all have to be abused relentlessly until eventually the perfect man just kind of springs up from nowhere. So to come back on some of the questions we've heard, there was a very good question from somebody in the audience about how do we empower women to take more sexual pleasure, and to the question about sex ed in schools. I would not be averse to that happening, although I suspect it would be quite difficult to get it through a kind of conservative majority for that at the moment. I do think that good communication is the heart of good sex. And when people have made some kind of sexual breakthrough where they realised what they enjoyed, it tended to be when you were bold and you expressed yourself and you explained what it was that you wanted. Unfortunately, I don't think the Me Too movement is always conducive to this, because I think quite often it frames sex as something that is done to women rather than something that women take ownership of and control. Question about gay men being excluded from these conversations. I think that Me Too, I think it's often a sense of the intersectionality element of Me Too that lets this down, because it's all about personal experiences. And I think the logical conclusion of a lot of intersectional feminism is that you actually can't empathise with someone who's not from your box. So that's why these groups that are not the women who are predominating the conversation right now may find themselves excluded. Question about why are men turning away from dating? I think opportunity cost a great point. I also think, and I get in trouble at work because I think that everything goes back to the housing crisis, and they sometimes tell me off for this. I think the housing crisis has to blame for this, because if you're living with your parents until you're 35, like the danger of your mum coming in with a teapot halfway through is not exactly conducive to great sex. So that's part of it. And finally, a few people talked about the idea of sex being politicised, and also the idea of sex being brought from the private into the public sphere. I completely agree with that. I think a lot of the solutions proposed to the Me Too movement have been kind of clumsy, clunky, technocratic. Things like consent apps, which we talked about, consent classes. These are all ways of kind of regulating sex through a kind of publicly determined morality. And I think both of these subject what should be private interactions to public scrutiny. So I don't think that is very conducive to intimacy, and I think that we're seeing the results of this in this, depressing trend away from sex. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeline. Okay, so just a few chair announcements. Melanie Phillips